Hi everyone, welcome to the January 12th edition of the TimeformUS Pacecast. I'm David Aragon, and I'll be joined in just a moment by my co-host Craig Mulkowski. This week on the podcast, we're going to do a recap of last weekend's racing from Santa Anita, Gulfstream, stakes races there that took place of the graded variety with the La Cienegas, the Las Cienegas, and at Gulfstream, the Tropical Turf. Some pretty nice speed figures in all of those. We'll talk about those in a little bit. We'll highlight some interesting maiden winners at those tracks. Then we'll move on to Aqueduct and Fairgrounds, where there was a stakes race to discuss at Aqueduct, a couple of allowance races at the Fairgrounds that earned some notable speed figures, and we'll finish things up at Tampa Bay Downs, just to mention a maiden winner that I thought was pretty eye-catching. But we're going to begin things with the stakes racing, and we'll start out west at Santa Anita, where they ran those pair of Grade 3 events on Saturday. And Craig, there were some pretty big upsets in both of these races.
Yeah, they were upsets both on the tote board and figure-wise for me, because there were some surprisingly fast races. The La Cienegas, won by Cienegas, was just a really good race. It was one with a lot of pace. We had pace figures that were over the 150 mark early in the race, with Hard Not to Love and Fighting Mad dueling on the front end. And Cienegas just tucked in behind them. Got a really nice trip. I always struggle with these trips. I'll be curious what you say, where she actually had to run really fast to be in the position she was. Her pace figures were in the 140s, but visually she was just sitting off the duel, getting all the best of it, took over and won easy, and she got a 121 TimeformUS speed figure. Some of the others in here, I thought Hard Not to Love ran pretty well to hang on to be third. I mean, it was a pretty distant third, but nearly got the place in a bob with Miss Stormy D, but I thought she clearly did all the dirty work in there. But I still have my reservations. I think she's more of a one-turn horse, and if I were the connections with her, I would definitely go that route from now on.
Yeah, I think the real story of this race, for me at least, is the deep and tiring track that we saw at Santa Anita on Saturday. We just saw a ton of horses throughout the day coming home very slowly, and those were in sprint races. This was actually the only route on the card, and we saw the toll that running over that surface took on these horses, especially given the early fractions that they ran. As you said, the early pace figures in this race were extremely fast for a mile and the 16th race, and Fighting Mad, she was unexpectedly dueling with her main rival, Hard Not to Love, who was uncharacteristically keen in the early going of this race. And through the first quarter mile, they kind of dueled themselves into defeat because they had a bit of an advantage on Cienegas into that first turn. She was sitting a good 2 to 3 lengths off of them, and they just expended way too much energy on the front end, and especially Fighting Mad, who I think the rider was probably surprised to see Hard Not to Love that close to him, and he spurted away from her on the backstretch. Her pace figure actually bumped up by one for the second call to a 151, which is just extremely fast to the half-mile pole in a mile and the 16th dirt race, and she had nothing left at the end of the race. Hard Not to Love did stay on for third here, but as you said, Cienegas, I mean, she was not that far off them, but she was always traveling better than those two leaders, and she took over on the far turn, just kept going. It kind of felt like one of those races where she was the only one who showed up and the others were just kind of disappointing. So I don't really know what to make of it, but you can't argue with the speed figure. She did run a fast race.
Yeah, I mean, she won by 6 lengths, so it's those kind of margins are generally going to lead the bigger speed figures. I will note that we do have the day coded in blue, probably in large part due to that deep tiring track, which means it was really tough to win up on her near the lead, and all the winners were basically coming from well behind, which isn't surprising on that surface. And, a really good race. I'd have my questions of whether she could repeat it or not. It would probably come to the tote board because given the way the track was playing, the fast fractions, it's just one of those, it's a tough trip to judge for me, and it would just depend how the bettors look at it.
Yeah, it reminds me of something that you would talk about in the wintertime at Aqueduct when we have this really deep, tiring track that can get kind of dry and sandy in the middle of winter, and you would see some horses post some gigantic speed figures over it and not necessarily run back to them in subsequent starts over surfaces that are playing a little more fairly from a speed standpoint. So I wonder if we'll see a similar thing with the way this track is at Santa Anita with Cienegas, because you got to be honest, she had never shown this kind of ability in her prior starts, losing some races in Kentucky to seemingly inferior horses. So we'll see what happens with her, but she definitely ran a fast race here. Moving on to the other graded stakes race on that Saturday card at Santa Anita, the Las Cienegas going 6 furlongs on that new extension to the turf course that they built where they're running those turf sprints out of now. And again, big upset here, though I think this upset was aided a little bit by what happened at the start as Alexandra, who was one of the 2 favorites, lost the rider. It appeared that she clipped heels coming out of the gate, and Joel Rosario went down to the turf course. He's okay. I'm glad to see that, but she was out of the race. And the other favorite in here, the one who was actually the prohibitive favorite on the tote board, Jolie Olympica, she just never really looked like a threat in this race. She was always outrun, never really was in contention. And Charmaine's Mia, who I've got to admit didn't really view her as a factor, certainly not as a pace factor, but she just ran them off their feet.
She did. She certainly looked like a new mare in the barn of Phil D'Amato, a trainer we've talked about often here, especially on the turf out west, and he gets it done with her. I have no idea where that early speed came from, and make no question about it to my mind. I mean, it was a deserving win. She went fast. It was though there was the incident at the beginning. It's not like she was able to get away with a slow pace. Her pace figures were in the 130s. She was battling for a little while with Bohemian Bourbon, who ran a decent 4th in there. It was only, I think, a 6 or 7 horse field, and as you say, one of them didn't finish due to this start. So. Just a big effort, and this is the kind of horse, due to the trainer change, I'm going to expect more of the same until I see differently, because while it was a big jump up from anything she'd been running recently, I didn't see anything that would suggest it was a fluke. I can't remember if I mentioned it. She got a 124 TimeformUS speed figure, which is the second biggest one that we're going to talk about all weekend, and just a really big effort from her.
Yeah, that puts her in the conversation with some of the fastest filly and mare turf sprinters in the country. So we'll see if she can hold that form. I mean, I was going back through her past performances to see if there was any clue that she had this kind of ability. And I don't know if she had ever even broken a 110 TimeformUS speed figure in the past. I mean, not certainly in the recent past. What she had done early in her career was shown a lot more speed, and it seemed as if they had sort of trained it out of her and gotten her to race as a closer in her recent starts at Woodbine. But apparently she still had that early speed in her, because she certainly flashed it here for Drayden Van Dyke, and as you said, off the trainer switch to Phil D'Amato. So she just seems like a new mare now as a 5-year-old for this barn. We'll see where she goes from here. I do have to say, I found the disqualification of the 3rd place finisher Lighthouse to be extremely disappointing. I guess there's always the temptation when, from the perspective of the stewards, to feel like you have to do something when there's an incident like Alexandra losing the rider and seeing a top rider like Joel Rosario hit the turf course. You feel like you want to take some kind of action to satisfy this feeling that something went wrong. I mean, I watched the head-on of this start a bunch of times. The pan, it was just a freak thing. It was a freak accident. I mean, there really wasn't much jostling out of the start at all. I mean, if you were going to disqualify a horse based on this start, you're going to disqualify a horse based on the start of every single horse race in this country. So I just found it disappointing that the stewards chose to penalize the bettors in this situation rather than taking the other options that were available to them.
Yeah, I would agree, which I don't get the call. I will note they've been DQing a lot more out in Southern California for incidents at the start. But again, I'm with you. I don't even know if I would call this an incident. I don't think anybody did anything wrong. It was just kind of thing where just very slight, not breaking completely straight resulted in an unfortunate event. But I don't know that anybody really deserved to be punished here. Sometimes these things happen.
No, it just shows a total disregard for the bettors and people who are spending their money to wager on these races. It's not realizing that this horse was the 3rd best in the race, and you're thinking that you should apply this standard that you would want to disqualify a horse if he was cost to position or something like that. I know that they're kind of breaking that precedent and setting a new precedent in California recently, so maybe that's not the rule that they're going by anymore. But for me, it was hard to make the argument that this start was that much different than what we would typically call a clean start. So I just found that to be extremely disappointing. Moving on, one more race to discuss from Santa Anita on this Saturday card, actually right before they ran the La Cañada. We're going to talk about the 7th race. That was a maiden special weight for the newly turned 3-year-olds, and kind of similar to what we just talked about in the Las Cienegas, another trainer switch to Phil D'Amato on the turf. This one, Earl's Rock, who is making his U.S. debut after one start in Ireland. he looked pretty good breaking his maiden here.
Yeah, he sure did, and he didn't really surprise anyone. He was only 5-2 on the morning line, bet down to 9-5. But he won as easy as could be. He just tracked a moderate pace, exploded through the lane, and did so. Got a 106 TimeformUS speed figure, which puts him right up there in stakes class with many of the early season 3-year-olds that we've seen.
Yeah, I mean, we'll see where they go from here with this horse, but he was no secret on the tote board, as you said, and coming out of that second place finish in Ireland, he had actually finished behind a horse named A Case of You, who came back to win a Group 3 race, so he certainly had the form to just be better than his U.S. counterparts here, and he was. We'll see where he goes from here, because, as you said, this was certainly the kind of performance that could catapult him into a stakes race. Move down south on the East Coast to Gulfstream Park, where they ran one graded stakes this past weekend on Saturday. That was the Tropical Turf, going a mile, and another pretty impressive performance on the grass here as Ride a Comet gets the better of Casa Creed. We had talked about this race on the forecast last week, how Casa Creed was kind of the class horse coming into this race, having competed against Grade 1 company pretty well last year. But Ride a Comet had shown that he had turned a corner for Mark Cassidy over the winter at Woodbine racing on synthetic, and it turns out he might actually be a better turf horse.
Yeah, and I don't think it surprised either one of us. I had commented on the forecast how you could pretty much ignore his last couple of speed figures because they came out of such slow pace races. But this is a horse who's done very little wrong in his career. He's now won 8 of 13 starts. He's won on synthetic. He's won on turf. He's won on dirt. So he's just a really versatile horse. I'm not sure how far he wants to go, but I wouldn't say the miles is limit based on what I saw Saturday, because I would argue that Casa Creed probably had a little bit better trip than he did, and he was still able to wear him down through the lane. They did so in a fast race. Ride a Comet got a 127 TimeformUS speed figure. Casa Creed got a 125. And I just think these two were clearly much the best in the field.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. And Casa Creed's a good barometer to use because he's been competitive in so many of these races. And aside from that poor effort in the Breeders' Cup Mile where he was a little overmatched, he's generally been pretty consistent recently. So I thought Ride a Comet ran a legitimate race to beat him. He was the one horse that made a bit of a run from a little farther off the pace. This was not a race that featured much pace up front. I thought Frostmorn, who was setting the pace, who is a good horse in his own right, he really had no excuse. The top two were just better than him. And as you said, Ride a Comet seems like a horse that probably does not want to go that much farther than a mile, but I think up to a mile, he could do some real damage in some tougher races this year, and he certainly seems like one that's tailor-made for a race like the Woodbine Mile around one turn later in the year. We'll see if they can keep him sound that long. I know he's a horse that's missed a lot of time in the past. I believe he's now a 6-year-old rather, who's only made 12 career starts, so we'll see what Mark Cassidy can do with him. He certainly likes to run his horses, but he's definitely one that appears to have the ability to go all the way in this mile division.
Yeah, and I should mention he did miss a long time, but before that, he had run a pretty consistent schedule without a break. I think he had bowed tendons, if I remember right. They let that heal, and now I think it's a really good sign that he's run 3 times in fairly short order and run well every time. So hopefully he stays on that path, and it looks to me like he will. I don't see anything that would look like he would have a setback.
Another race that we talked about on the TimeformUS forecast last Friday was an allowance race on Sunday, which featured the return of Mischievous Alex, who was also making his first start off a trainer switch to Safi Joseph. And we had been a little bit concerned about the rail post position for this horse because it seemed like there was a lot of speed drawn outside of him. It turned out that was the case and he couldn't make the lead from the rail, but it really didn't matter because he was just so much better than this field.
Yeah, I would say, given the way he drew inside, that Irad Ortiz was probably the perfect rider for him in this spot. He gave him a great ride. He didn't panic when he wasn't on the lead, and he was able to work out a good trip. And this horse just exploded through the lane. He's only getting a 117 TimeformUS speed figure, in large part because the early part of the race was so slow, but his final time figure was a 124, which I believe is the best he's ever run. So to me, he came back as good as ever here. Put those bad efforts behind him from before the layoff and looks like a serious threat as a 4-year-old.
This race reminds me a lot of the race that we saw Vekoma run when he came off the layoff last year for George Weaver. It was a similar situation where he was coming out of he was running in a race, a sprint. I forget if it was a stakes or a minor stakes race or a high level allowance, but it featured a slow pace and he had come home really fast the final eighth of a mile. He'd gotten a big final time number, but it was knocked down on the TimeformUS speed figures. And obviously Vekoma showed that he was the kind of horse that could run back to that final time number and even improve on it. And I feel like Mischievous Alex is probably the same kind of horse. He was running speed figures as a 3-year-old going all the way back to the spring of last year that would make him competitive in some graded stakes race sprinting as an older horse. So it stands to reason that he could run a lot faster now, and I think he showed that here. And it's not like he's the kind of horse that needs the lead or needs pace to close into. He's pretty versatile. He can do it on the front end. Based on this race, he can do it from just off the pace. So I'm very intrigued to see what he can do against graded stakes level foes in the future.
Yeah, it's a good point you make about the speed figures. He's the kind of horse when he shows up next time, I'm not going to bet him like he ran a 117 last time. I'm going to lean more towards that 124 and maybe even better than that because he's a horse who was getting better as a 3-year-old. And I imagine I think he has a pretty high upside. So he's one I'm sure we'll see him in a stakes race next time, probably of the graded variety. And I think he'd be a strong contender.
Another horse who made an impressive return to the races at Gulfstream Park last week was Superfecto, who ran an allowance race this past Wednesday. He had broken his maiden at a big price at Gulfstream last winter, had some setbacks thereafter, just made one start since then in the slop at Belmont, didn't handle it. He was again coming off the layoff on Wednesday at Gulfstream, and he was pretty impressive to win this race. I don't really know what he was beating, but he certainly looked good doing it.
Yeah, it is hard to say what he was beating, but he did get a 116 TimeformUS speed figure. He kind of repeated that pattern from when he started his career. He just ran a conquer first time out with some trouble, admittedly, but just was well beaten and then came back with an easy win and a much improved speed figure. And he did the same exact thing this time. So as a very lightly raced 4-year-old, he certainly has some upside. He's by constitution out of a Ghost Zapper mare, so I don't think a mile is the limit for him. He could probably go a little further, and with any improvement, he's another one that could be headed towards stakes races.
Yeah, he's got a nice pedigree. He's by constitution, and the second dam is Society Selection, who was such a good horse, I believe, for Alan Jerkins, who won the test in the Alabama. So he's definitely one that has potential. I think for him, it's just a matter of whether or not he can stay on the racetrack because he's now made 4 starts in the span of about a year. But he does have ability. There were some other horses that took money in this race, ones that had shown potential at different times in the past that didn't really show up on this day. So there were quality horses behind them. I just feel like they might not have run their A race here. But Superfecto, he definitely has talent, and we'll see if he can continue progressing. One more race to mention from Gulfstream Park last week was a race on Sunday's card. It was actually the one that was the last race of the day, run right after Mischievous Alex won that allowance race. This was a maiden on the turf for the 3-year-old fillies, and a pretty impressive turf debut from the Todd Pletcher-trained jouster, a filly who had been bet down to favoritism in both starts on dirt last year. Turns out, though, that she is definitely a turf horse.
Yeah, that was quite the turn of foot there. She won off by over a half, I think it was over 8 lengths. She got a 112 TimeformUS speed figure and just a really good performance. I mean, that kind of number would win a lot, if not most, of the 3-year-old filly stakes we've seen, or going back to last year, 2-year-olds. And she just did it the right way. Now, she did have the lead all to herself. She wasn't going particularly fast, but I did really like the way she finished off the race. Just a really big effort from her. From a horse, I generally don't like horses who show speed and don't have much finish and move to the turf, but in her case, the surface clearly made a difference.
Yeah, I mean, I don't usually like to make predictions about maiden winners, but this filly feels like she has a big future, and a horse who breaks the maiden like this is supposed to be winning graded stakes races in the very near future, and I would imagine that's going to be coming for her. This was just an exceptional performance. I know she had everything her own way on the front end and was uncontested, but I mean, she just looked like she was in a different race than everybody else. And she had this big, impressive stride on the dirt, but she wasn't really able to sustain it. And when they stretched her out in the dirt, she just seemed to have nothing left for the final quarter mile in that last race that we saw her in racing at Belmont. But here, that large stride of hers translated so well to the dirt, to the turf, and she was just powering away from this field on the far turn under no encouragement from Luis Saez. He barely set her down in the stretch, and she just continued to elongate that stride and run away from this field. She finished up very impressively, with, if anything, gaining speed as they came to the wire. Just super impressed with this horse, and she does have a big pedigree if you go deeper in the dam side. She's a daughter of Noble Mission. We've seen the Noble Missions run on both surfaces, but obviously he was a turf horse himself. And the second dam is Storm Flag Flying, that excellent Phipps filly who was a daughter of My Flag, the daughter of Personal Ensign. So a really nice lineage of Phipps horses here, and they all seem to have a little bit of turf pedigree in there, even though they were all dirt horses. So just very exciting to see where this filly's going to go.
Yeah, and good point you make about the finish, because that's what I want to see with these impressive maiden winners when they move to turf. You don't want to see them getting tired as they approach the finish line, even as they win, and that certainly wasn't the case with her. She was finishing full of run, and that's what you need in turf races. Speed it still definitely works on turf, but you do have to have that finish.
Let's move to a few other venues, beginning with Aqueduct, where they ran stakes race last Saturday, early in the day, the Safe Florida Sandy. It was just a 5-horse field, due largely to the presence of the heavy favorite Funny Guy, a horse who had been very competitive in some graded stakes last year, even sent as the favorite in the Grade 1 Forgo. But Funny Guy has been a little bit unreliable lately. Nevertheless, he looked like he was probably better than this field. He didn't show up, though, and now it's the second time in his last 3 starts that's happened, including when he ran a poor race in the Empire Classic 3-back. And Our Last Buck for Michelle Nevin, this was his stakes debut, but he's really been coming along slowly for Michelle Nevin, who's done a great job with him, and he was good enough to upset the favorite here.
Yeah, he was. He's been moving in the right direction, as you say. On the weight-adjusted speed figures, he had actually run the same speed figure that Funny Guy had last time. Now, obviously, Funny Guy had a more impressive resume as you went deeper, but the odds discrepancy was pretty big. And really, I don't think Funny Guy had any excuse at all. They basically ran as a tandem with Funny Guy just ahead of Our Last Buck, and he just didn't have anything for him when they turned for home. Personally, I was a little disappointed in the speed figure. I thought it would come back a little faster. Our Last Buck only got a 110, which is disappointing, especially considering it was a pretty fast pace for that track. The opening quarter mile with Running with Scissors had a 139 TimeformUS speed pace figure. So they certainly had pace to run into, and overall, it's just kind of an underwhelming race for me, but I mean, I think the best horse on the day clearly won it.
Yeah, and I thought Kendrick Carmouche gave Our Last Buck an excellent ride, because he's been a horse that's done his best running when he's right up on the pace. Hasn't really seemed like one that wants to be behind horses. That had certainly been his undoing when he was sprinting earlier in his career, and he had done so much better when they stretched him out and he was able to use that tactical speed of his. But I thought Kendrick Carmouche made a great decision to take him a little bit further off the pace here, given how fast they were going up front, and he just traveled sweetly in behind those horses, tipped out in the stretch, and you could see he was just finishing so much better than Funny Guy in the late going. So I agree. I was hoping this race would come back a little bit faster. I think the fact that Our Last Buck won this race by the margin he did was just largely a function of the fact that Funny Guy didn't show up. So we'll see if Our Last Buck can win a tougher stakes race next time out. But I do just want to credit the job that Michelle Nevin's done with him and the great ride that Kendrick Carmouche gave him.
Yeah, and as far as the speed figure goes, I do want to mention this was one of those slow Aqueduct tracks that we've gotten used to in the winter. It only got a 5 on the 1 to 10 Timeform US scale on the speed of the track. And speed figures aren't precise anyway. Some people like to pretend that there's a big difference between a 111 and a 109. And you know, you'd like to think it is, and we do the best we can. But you just can't be that precise. And when the track's as slow as this one was, the variants get really big. So I would say there's even more fudge room in there, if that's what I can call it, where, maybe if you say speed figures are accurate within 2 points on a normal track, the farther you get to these more extreme tracks, maybe it's 4 or 5 points. But I mean, we do the best we can, and it just gets tougher the more extreme the track gets, whether fast or slow, but particularly slow, because it tends to gap the horses quite a bit more.
That's a really good point, and I know it's something that you've struggled with quite a bit, given how slowly these tracks play throughout the winter at Aqueduct, because you do see a lot of variance in these times, and I know that can make it difficult on a speed figure maker that's trying to make sense of all these races within a day at all these different distances, because they do run a much larger variety of distances at Aqueduct in the winter now.
Yeah, I sure miss the inner. It was so easy back then.
Yeah, the larger the number of comparisons, the easier it is to make a speed figure always. Sticking at Aqueduct, on Thursday, we saw an allowance race. Another winner ridden by Kendrick Carmouche, who I have to say, coming into this winter, Kendrick was riding great, but he's just dominating the rider standings at Aqueduct. And I mean, he's really diversified what he does well. He's become from off the pace, on the lead, running all different types of horses for different barns. And I think he's up by like 10 wins over Jose Lezcano. I just really want to commend how well he's riding and the level of confidence that he's bringing to every mount. And that was certainly the case with Lil Commissioner in this Thursday allowance race we're going to talk about. I don't think he really had to use his skills, though, in this situation, because Lil Commissioner was only facing 3 rivals, and he was just so much better than them.
Yeah, he was. And I mean, on paper, it didn't really look like it coming in. It looked like a pretty evenly matched field speed figure wise, but he was able to just sit right off the flank of Rock on Luke, put him away, and just run away from the field. He got a 1:17 TimeformUS speed figure for the win, which is his career best. And he is a 6-year-old, so I'm not sure how much upside this one has, but has to be a good sign when you're running career best. And I don't think he had any particularly easy trip or anything like that. I think it was just a good improving horse.
Yeah, Lil Commissioner is kind of a funny horse to look at his PPs, because he had been in barns of Robertino Diodoro. He had been with Jorge Navarro for a while, and he didn't look like this kind of horse for those trainers, but he's just a different horse for trainer Rob Atras, and also a different horse since they've really focused on dirt racing with him. For so long, they had been running him on the turf, which is what his pedigree would suggest, but turns out he's just a better dirt horse, and he's achieved a level that I didn't think he was capable of, at least when we were familiar with this horse racing last spring and summer. In recent starts, winning these high-level allowance races, but he's apparently loving this Aqueduct course. And he'll have to face a tougher test next time if they continue moving up these allowance conditions, or probably into a stakes race, I would imagine, because this was, I think, a non-winners of 3 other than. But he's definitely a horse that's performing at the highest level we've ever seen out of him. Finishing up the action at Aqueduct, I just want to talk about one more race. That's from Sunday's card. This was a maiden special weight event for the 3-year-old fillies that went as the first race of the day. And Dealing Justice, who is making her second career start for Ray Handel, won here and just ran a pretty fast speed figure for horses that have just turned 3 years old.
Yeah, for a 3-year-old filly, she got a 1:05 TimeformUS speed figure, improved about 8 points off of that debut. So it was a really nice effort from her. Not a big surprise. She improved second time out for Ray Handel. His numbers do go up he doesn't win a lot first time out, does better second time, but I think this was a pretty solid field. I mean, she had run that 97, but was still only the second choice, I believe, in here. Ogotten Girl had run a couple big numbers, so she's starting to get the feel of maybe she's got that professional maiden thing to her. But, pretty decent number for a 3-year-old filly. And I would imagine maybe they'll try to find an allowance race for her next time. Not sure she's quite ready for stakes yet, but those don't always fill, so it's hard to say.
Yeah, while Dealing Justice is an encouraging prospect in her own right, I think the most interesting thing about this race is that she legitimized the very high speed figure that the winner of her debut had received, because she finished third with a 97 that day, losing the race by 10 lengths to that Tony Dutrow second-time starter, Miss Brazil, who got a 110 for winning that November 29th maiden race. And we have yet to see Miss Brazil or the runner-up Caramel Swirl, like a Dolphin and Bill Mott trained filly, who also seems very promising. Neither of them have run back yet, but that seems like a maiden race that is legitimately fast. Potentially the speed figure is even a little bit low based on how well Dealing Justice ran on her second start. So I'm just very intrigued to see how those horses do coming out of that very fast race.
That's a good point you bring up. I had a question on Twitter, which I told the guy I'd get back to, but I haven't had a chance yet, about a 2-year-old turf race at Gulfstream and how every horse had improved coming out of it. And I will investigate that. Maybe I'll bring it up again next week when we do this. But it's really tricky with 2-year-olds because they're going to be improving anyway. So I just want to say, in the case of Dealing Justice, her moving up 8 points, I'm not sure that would trigger me to think, oh, maybe the figure was wrong. I mean, it's possible it is. But you just got to take in you're thinking, how likely were these horses to improve as it was? Now, if we're talking the whole field came back and was running 20-point new top, sure, I would think so. But 8 points is really not a big deal for 2-year-olds, especially early season 3-year-olds. So just something to keep in mind for our customers when they look through our charts. Maybe they'll see a 2-year-old race where every horse is improving 5, 6, 10, 11 points. It doesn't necessarily mean that first race there's a problem with the figure. It's just how these horses develop. And it's actually built into the way I make my speed figures. I actually project how much development these horses on average get and kind of use it when I do my projections.
No, I mean, I wasn't meaning to suggest that the speed figure was too low or was way off for that race. Nothing of the sort. Rather just that when you see a maiden race come back as fast as that November 29th race did, where Miss Brazil ran a 110 and the horses who dead heated for third were running 98s and 97s, and it's a 2-year-old maiden race, I think it's natural to be a little bit skeptical that there were so many horses with that kind of talent all in one maiden race at Aqueduct. But I think just based on the way Dealing Justice ran, it gives some legitimacy to that race to suggest that maybe that was just a race where there were 4 really talented horses participating.
Oh yeah, I didn't take it that way at all, but it just jarred my memory to that tweet, made me think, because I've been meaning to respond to that and actually do the research. But yeah, my main point was 2-year-olds are going to improve. So when you look at these charts, expect to see that, because more often than not, you're going to see the numbers going up as you scroll through the running lines. As we make it easy in our charts, you just click the arrow and you can go back and forth through horses' entire careers. And assuming things go well physically, they should keep going up as you move to the left.
We're done with the stakes racing, but a couple more maiden and allowance races to talk about at 2 more venues, beginning with the Fairgrounds, where on Saturday they ran an allowance race going a mile and a 16th on the dirt course, and a pretty interesting winner of this race in Hopcat, who was making his second start off the claim here for Tom Amoss, a horse that had really been focused on sprinting early in his career, but Tom Amoss stretched him out off the claim, and it just seems like he's a completely different horse going a route distance.
Yeah, he's tried it twice in his career, and now he's won twice. And kind of interesting to note, the one time he tried 2 turns on turf, he actually ran a speed figure very similar or better to what he had gotten on the dirt. So, I mean, 2 turns appears to be his thing. Definitely dirt, but he was really impressive here. This one jumped out at me when my assistant, he does the fairground, sent the speed figures back, and I processed the data, and it came up as a 120, moved up 8 points off his 112, but I went and watched the replay when I saw the figure, and nothing leads me to believe it wasn't just a totally legit performance. He was dominant from start to finish. The pace was pretty even throughout. It wasn't slow or fast. So looks like a horse who's just getting really good, and Tom Amoss has found what he's best at.
Yeah, and based on the pedigree, it feels like, I mean, it's natural to ask the question, why was this horse going short from the beginning? Because he's a son of, I believe, Stay Thirsty, who obviously could go a mile, but much farther than that, almost winning the Belmont Stakes. And on the dam side is Dam Granny McKitten. She was a stakes winner going route distance on the turf. She's a full sister to Kitten's Dumplings, who I think won the QE2 at Keeneland. So plenty of route pedigree here for either surface, and just seemed like this horse has really turned a corner. The one caveat is that this horse got an absolutely perfect trip, set a good uncontested pace through pretty moderate fraction, so you wonder what a horse like this will do when he gets real pace pressure, but he's certainly doing well right now and has earned the right to step up in class after this.
Yeah, and I was going to comment, it's not, he did go wire to wire, as you mentioned, but the previous time he came from well off the pace, and it was a 6-horse field. He was back and forth, several lengths behind. So, I mean, I think that's a good sign that he's showing he's kind of versatile around the 2 turns. If he doesn't have to have the lead. His best figure did come on the lead so far, but that's something we often see because horses save all the ground and have nice, comfortable journeys. But he's promising for me.
Another promising runner from last week, I should say, at Fairgrounds was the winner of an allowance race last Wednesday. That was Born Great, who won going 5.5 furlongs, their 6th race on the Wednesday card. And this is just a horse that's shown flashes of talent in the past. He's a 5-year-old who's only made a handful of starts in his career, but he had posted a very high speed figure at Kentucky Downs last fall. He's had some stops and starts in his career, but seems like Brendan Walsh really has him heading in the right direction here. And he was pretty impressive in this race to turn back multiple challenges and win gate to wire.
Yeah, the pace was fairly quick. He ran a 125 pace figure early, was able to fight off some others. Still finished up, got a 115 TimeformUS speed figure. And I think what I was most impressed with was this was the first time he's ever been anywhere near the lead in the beginning. So maybe a change in tactics was a good thing for him. But he's just more versatile than the connections realized and could be up closer than he had previously shown.
Yeah, and we're going to see what he can do pretty soon because I just saw it. I was looking through the Fairgrounds entries for this Saturday. They entered him right back in a stakes race there against some pretty tough turf sprinters. So we'll see if he stacks up against those horses. But he was certainly better than this field, and I think he's a lightly raced horse that even though he's 5 years old now, he still has some upside. Let's finish things up with one more race that I wanted to discuss. I'm sure this wasn't a race that Craig would have sent in because it didn't come back that fast from a speed figure standpoint, but there was a maiden race last Friday at Tampa Bay Downs that was won by a 4-year-old first-time starter for Chad Brown and Klarovich Stables. This horse is named Principal Stand, and it's the kind of race that I'm always hesitant to say that horses could have run much faster than the final time indicates, but this is just a horse that when you watch this turf race, he was in a completely different league than the horses he was competing against.
Yeah, I would agree. The shocking thing to me when you sent it is that I went and watched it and seeing the horse went off 7-2. That was pretty amazing. Why I must have been asleep that day, but I missed that one. But yeah, Klarovich, first-time starter for Chad Brown, wins. He got a 97, but he did it the right way. He went right to the front, relaxed, and just exploded home. So I don't know how much more he has. I would agree with you. He could have run faster. Definitely has that look to me watching the replay, but it's a case of just how much faster. He is a 4-year-old. He's lightly raced, so I wouldn't expect the same improvement if we were talking about a horse who just turned 3, but he certainly still has some upside, and he's one more following.
Yeah, he is one of these horses that they purchased overseas as a yearling at the Tattersall sale. I know that Klarovich and Chad Brown has an excellent record with those horses that they bring over here from Europe. And it took him a while to get to the races. I wouldn't make too much of the fact that he debuted at Tampa Bay Downs because I know that some trainers aren't thrilled with the prospect of running over that Gulfstream Park turf course. So sometimes you get an easier race into them at Tampa. But he was just really impressive. If you haven't seen the race, it was the 7th race on Friday. It's just one to go back and watch because this horse looks like one that has potential. How much potential and how far can he go? Given that he is a 4-year-old, I think it remains to be seen, but just one to keep an eye on when he steps up against tougher company next time.
Yeah, and Tampa's definitely worth following with some of these maiden races. This was a little different for older horses, but we've seen a lot of really good horses debut at Tampa over the years and come back and do some really good things.
That's all the racing that we're going to recap from last week. We'll get back and stick on that 2 podcast a week schedule. for this week, we'll have that TimeformUS forecast coming out on Friday, and I imagine we'll spend quite a bit of time discussing that Fairgrounds card where they're running the first of many Derby preps, the Lecomte. I believe that's the final race on their 13-race card, but there are plenty of stakes races throughout the day. I've just taken a cursory glance so far. It looks like a good card, so I'm sure I'll find plenty to discuss there, and we'll look at other tracks around the country and see if there are any other races we want to discuss this upcoming Friday.
Yeah, sounds good to me. For me, the Lecomte's always kind of the kickoff of the Triple Crown season. I know there's been some preps already and some early season wins, but I don't know. I always just look at this as when it really starts.
And I'll be resuming my TimeformUS Derby Prep Analysis series, which I do on video on DRF.com, so you can check that out. I'll be filming that tomorrow, so it should be out late Wednesday. We'll take a look at a bunch of horses in the Lecomte, do kind of an in-depth discussion of a bunch of the contenders. So check that out later in the week, and that'll be coming for all the Derby preps throughout this Triple Crown season. So thanks for listening this week, everybody. Remember, you can always tune into us on DRF.com, Spotify, iTunes, YouTube, and SoundCloud. Wherever you get your podcast, just make sure to subscribe to the Daily Racing Form channel. Thanks for listening, and stay tuned for the TimeformUS forecast on Friday.